Tables and seats are now on sale for the biggest night in the digital video calendar, the Telecast Digital Video Awards. We're celebrating excellence in the only awards ceremony created especially for the social video industry, with over 100 channels, shows and series shortlisted across 27 categories. It all takes place on the evening of 5th of June during South by Southwest London Week at the luxurious Londoner Hotel in Leicester Square. The guest list reads like the who's who in the next generation of entertainment. So book your table, half table or seat now and join the talent and executives shaping the content industry of tomorrow. Just visit digitalvideoawards.co.uk to secure your place now. The Telecast Digital Video Awards, the biggest night in the digital video calendar. We'll see you there. Hi, I'm Justin Crosby. This week on Telecast, we're going behind the scenes of Hearst Networks UK's digital-first operation. From original formats like History Crush, Unbreakable and Cut to the Crime, to social-first programming and branded content partnerships, Hearst Networks UK is building a slate of video programming that's smart, scalable and platform native. I'm joined by Sam Pearson, digital commissioning editor and lead content producer at Hearst Networks EMEA, to discuss how the business has evolved, what's driving audience growth across platforms like YouTube and Facebook, and how they're tailoring content for both social and linear. We're going to talk about branded partnerships as well and what success really looks like in digital publishing today. It's all coming up on this week's Telecast. Sam, how are you doing?
Not so bad. How are you doing? You all right?
I'm all right, yeah. Welcome to Telecast, and we've got a bit of a Yorkshire doubleheader here, which I'm delighted.
Softened accents, though.
Yes. Yeah, they are softened a little bit, aren't they? You know, we probably sound really broad to a lot of people, but,
sure.
You know, yes, a little bit softer than it is when we're up in Leeds and Bradford. So welcome to the show. Tell us about your role then and what you do at Hearst Networks UK.
Yeah, of course. So I've got kind of a multifaceted role, really. I head up the first part is I head up the social media teams and the short form AVOD production teams. That's producing the marketing content that promotes our channels and shows, and also our kind of like archive library driven content that we push out on YouTube and Facebook that generates revenue as well as bringing eyeballs to our content and to our channels. Alongside that, I also work with our kind of creative teams and our own kind of content production for promotional again, and also any kind of short form activity that we produce in-house. And then the more exciting part of it, to a certain degree, and the one that's kind of more relevant today, is the commissioning side, where I head up digital first commissioning for Hearst Networks. And that is kind of anything from short form, mid form, podcast, anything that's kind of got a digital first and social first grammar to it.
Fantastic. Well, you're in the right place, and this is something I'm really passionate about. So I'm delighted that we've got you in to have a chat about it. So first of all, Hearst Networks, there was a corporate change in name, wasn't there, about a year or so ago from A&E? Can you just explain that a little bit, just so people understand the relationship when it comes to A&E and Hearst and what that name change was all about?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, ultimately a cosmetic change, really more than anything. So the business hasn't really changed, and we're still very much kind of driven by the same purpose in terms of kind of sharing stories that matter, same channel brands. But what we've done is change the name from A&E Networks UK, A&E Networks EMEA for our wider business, to Hearst Networks UK, Hearst Networks EMEA, really to kind of match one half of our parent shareholder, which is Hearst, alongside the other parent, which is Sky. Really to kind of make it a little bit more kind of cohesive and perhaps make it a little bit more sense to consumers and to the people and partners that we work with.
Yeah. And so tell us about, you talked about channel brands. Remind us about the channel brands that you're overseeing at Hearst.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so we license channel brands from our kind of cousins across the pond, A&E Networks. So we distribute content across Sky History, which is otherwise known as the History Channel, to people from thinking like generations previous, but also people outside of the UK where it's known as Sky History. We also have Crown Investigation and Blaze in the UK, alongside a whole host of fast channels as well. And we also have alongside our parent brands, Play channels, SVOD Properties, both history play and crime investigation play.
So we're going to focus more on digital first, obviously. That's really your expertise and responsibility within the business. So give us a sense of how long Hearst Networks UK has sort of been approaching the digital first play, if you like, because you talked about, you've obviously got an amazing catalogue, and that's something that can be monetized, in a relatively straightforward way, but also original as well. Can you give us a sense of how long you've been playing in the social video space?
It already kind of happened or started to happen, and the thinking behind it kind of came around kind of beginning of the pandemic, so like 2020, really kind of, and perhaps kind of, the foundation started a little bit before that, but really it kind of happened when we were all on Teams and Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were kind of looking at how we can kind of make sure we're finding as much value out of our channel brands, following the eyeballs as they're kind of starting to move away from kind of traditional TV channels into other areas of the media landscape, and really it was very much about kind of like finding our feet first and foremost in the short form space by using our library content on YouTube and Facebook primarily, testing the water, and Snapchat. Obviously, kind of making sure that we utilize our content across other non-monetizable platforms to a certain extent, like Instagram or perhaps TikTok in the early days, Twitter, X, Threads, those kind of places where you can still generate communities and fandoms, but you're not generating AVOD revenue.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like really where it started, and we saw some really decent success, not just in terms of making some revenue that essentially kind of covers the activity itself, but also finding new eyeballs for our content that ultimately ladder up into our kind of more traditional TV viewing experience, driving people to kind of watch our shows and channel brands in places like the SVOD space play or history play and crime investigation play, or on Sky and Virgin and those kind of areas.
Yeah. So was it a bit of a real sort of test and learn approach, Ray? You talk about building communities, which is super important, and a lot of networks don't necessarily have that relationship other than, basic, social feeds. But it seems to me that you guys have really kind of grasped the nettle on this and really sort of iterated and moved forward in quite quietly, but now it's quite substantial, the amount of work that you're doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I certainly wouldn't want to claim that we were kind of like, ahead of the game. Certainly there was a whole lot of other broadcasters doing exactly the same thing and thinking exactly the same way as us. We did some stuff that was slightly different and made, mistakes as everyone has done and learned from them. But for us, it's very much about kind of getting on that front foot and making sure that we're understanding kind of how our audiences kind of consume the content. And that then ultimately, when you talk about kind of test and learn, then led to the kind of the more commissioning style stuff. And so as a project, we've set up our what was kind of termed as our digital originals, but our kind of digital first kind of programming through short form, mid form, or podcast content. We have produced short form series and podcast series before this, but ultimately it wasn't done with a kind of concerted effort. And really that was in the last kind of 3 years, 2.5, 3 years. And for us, it's really about test and learn in that space, producing new series, new formats, working with new talent, really kind of understanding kind of themes and topics and tonality that our audience want to kind of consume, but using our social platforms or the digital first landscape or the narrative that kind of comes with, grammar that comes with digital first, to like kind of play around with it and be a little bit of a sandbox. So it kind of gives us that little bit more flexibility. What we were looking for, obviously, is to double down on something that works. We want to kind of chase, ultimately, views and revenue further down the line. But the initial kind of motivation is very much about what we can learn. And that kind of comes from, talent that we can kind of test, that we have an idea about, that we maybe want to kind of like push through to a linear show that's coming through from a pathway that perhaps is a little bit less traditional for a kind of like a traditional factual communicator, or it might be a new format that we perhaps wouldn't have had the appetite to maybe test in a traditional landscape first and foremost, but allows us that little bit of flexibility to try it out first. Or partnerships and working with new content creators or producers that we maybe not necessarily have the budget to kind of like to work with everybody, because we'd love to, but we are slightly smaller and niche in our outset. So really, it's very much about that. And then ultimately, when it kind of goes to audience, then learning from how they kind of consume it, and that would be making sure that we're kind of paying as much attention as possible to thumbnails and titles, really kind of over-analysing to a certain degree the retention curves and really kind of thinking about where those drop-off points are or where those spikes are, really going to go into intense detail to kind of like understand what it is that our audience likes and trying not to kind of get too obsessed with views and numbers that perhaps a little bit more kind of ego-driven or vanity, and really kind of making sure that we're kind of focusing on stuff that we can learn from and then iterate into the next project.
So loads of interesting things there. So let's first of all talk about library, and obviously that was a place that you started.
Sure.
Was most of, I mean, obviously you'll have different rights positions with different shows, for example. I can imagine that. But has that library exploitation on social channels, has that led you to thinking in different ways about the sort of linear commissions that you make? So, for example, is there the possibility, or has there been a possibility of some library shows doing really, really well on socials and giving you all the right sort of indicators to think, okay, we might need to reboot this, or we might need to, create a new series of this for linear as well? Is that the way that you're thinking?
Yes. And it's not my place to kind of talk about that because the long form responsibility kind of sits with my colleagues, Dan and Di, although I do kind of work on a couple of the long form commissions that have that kind of like digital first narrative. And we do have a couple of examples of that where the content that the short form team, the AVO team, or social media team are putting out has really driven the conversation in terms of talent and formats that are perhaps, years old, that maybe would have just been left in a box or packed away in a storage somewhere and then never really kind of considered again. But actually, it's brought up those conversations again. I can't talk about any of them,
right?
But it genuinely has kind of like driven some of those conversations, and hopefully, fingers crossed, the next time I'm on here, I can kind of point those shows out.
Interesting. Okay. So, well, let's talk about the original content and the original commissions that you made. So there's quite a few, right? There's quite a few projects that you've commissioned. History Crush is one of those. Tell us a little bit about that and how that came about, and explain that show a little bit to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So History Crush has been a show. Well, actually, kind of like the germ of an idea for probably the best part of a year and a half. We've worked with Katie Kennedy, who is otherwise known as the History Gossip on TikTok and Instagram. We've been working with her and speaking to her for a number of years now. We've been working with her on a couple of kind of PR activities, on some of our social content. And we've known how great and fresh a communicator she is. She's authentic. She speaks in a language that is very, very different to kind of like your traditional factual history kind of presenter, but also has the authority because she is a historian herself to be able to kind of talk to the insight and the intelligence that kind of like the factual content should deliver. So we know there was something in there. For us, it was about finding the right partner and the right format and the right time really to kind of bring it all together. And so in that early development, we were talking about how to pull the idea together, and we were discussing Katie's strengths, innumerable strengths, and really kind of like the initial kind of development conversation was going along the lines of chicken shop dates, Amelia de Molenberg meets Philomena Kunk, but keep it factual, real.
Yeah.
And because Katie has that kind of style, that kind of like off the wall, disarming, slightly uncomfortable kind of like style to her, which I think is really interesting and kind of grip your attention and really deliver something in a very new and interesting way. And what the team, Tom and Dom, who worked on it, who exec the idea, what they kind of brought together, and the rest of the team that worked on it, is something really kind of like exciting for us, because it's not something that Sky History would produce normally. We'd maybe kind of touch on something, we'd maybe kind of go halfway there, but for us, it's completely new. Like, we would never talk in this kind of language before, and we never put something like this together. So for us, it's a real test in terms of whether there's an audience appetite for that. And ultimately, it allows us to then work with Katie right at the inception of her career, and kind of like hopefully develop her a little bit in terms of those kind of first initial steps into TV, because whether she stays in TV or whether she goes off and does bigger and brighter things elsewhere, she will do those bigger and brighter things because she has that kind of, that magic stardust, that quality that will that will kind of define, I'm sure, the rest of her career. So for me, I'm really excited about it, and it's just launched, and the early signs are from a social perspective that it's landing really well, and we're seeing some really kind of great insight from our VOD channels as well, and hopefully, fingers crossed, in a few weeks, months' time, when we're kind of digging into the data and looking at it, then we'll see some really interesting stuff and some strong lessons.
And this is, so give us a sense of the format then for the show. It's social first, social video essentially. Give us an idea of, length and
yeah,
what
of course.
show is.
Our kind of short form / mid form content is roughly 3 to 8 minutes. We have a cap at 8 minutes that's based on our carriage deals with our channel. So it's a hard and fast rule for us, which is a challenge when it comes to distribution across YouTube and other platforms which want to kind of go a little bit longer, if ideally, as long as the kind of viewers, you retain your viewers. But for us, it's a challenge that kind of like allows us to then be kind of more creative in terms of the content that we produce. So History Crush is an 8-minute show. It is social first, but it has that quality and delivery of a TV show. But obviously, it just doesn't have as many kind of bells and whistles and cutaways and VTs and everything else that would build up to make a commercial half hour. And it's produced in a way that allows us to kind of go vertical very easily, but done in a way that people would feel comfortable watching it in horizontal and or vertical. And that really kind of comes down to kind of like the ethos of what we're trying to do as well, is try to be slightly strategically unstrategic in the way that we distribute, and try and kind of work out how we can kind of reach as many different people as possible across different platforms, and work out how they want to kind of consume content and learn as much from that as possible.
And ultimately, is the opportunity then, if all the data's right, and looking in 6 months' time or however long that period is, that it could ladder up to become a full blown linear show? Is that sort of the idea, the ultimate aim, or I mean, how do you view that?
My personal ambition, absolutely, for sure. I mean, obviously, it's going to be driven by success of the show. It's going to be driven by budgets and schedules and, the right time, all that kind of stuff, all the good stuff that kind of comes into kind of broadcast decisions, right? But from a selfish perspective, I want to see it work. I want to work with Katie again on another series, obviously, if it does work. I'd love it if that relationship then ladders up into either a linear commission of something similar to History Crush, or Katie working on a different series, as a host or contributor or something else. And for me, that's kind of like at the heart of everything that we're doing is, we're talking about kind of like how we work with talent, develop those relationships. Where's Katie's place within our brand? At the same time, I'm also kind of looking at her and thinking, there's no holds barred for her in terms of where she can kind of go and work with in terms of other broadcasters. It'd be great to kind of see her go on to bigger and better things, and work on massive projects elsewhere. But at the same time, it'd be nice if that's with us, and it'd be great to kind of see her on some linear shows for sure. History Crush in itself is a interview series with Katie, sat opposite a historian contributor, looking at characters from history and deciding, based on their positive and negative crush points, whether they're a crush or a burn. Really, it's about kind of Katie dissecting with her own style whether Charles II, Napoleon, Elizabeth I, Cleopatra are worthy of a date, or whether they're worth sticking in the bin in your phraseology.
Yes.
And Katie's kind of sat opposite an expert historian who's going to help kind of guide her along that decision making journey. But at the same time, it's done with a nice kind of like wink and a glance, and it's very fresh, it's energetic, and it is genuine and laugh out loud funny.
Yeah.
And obviously at the same time you're learning something, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and it's obviously centered around her personality as well.
Absolutely.
So there's a few other formats that you've also commissioned. Tell us about Unbreakable. That's another one, isn't it, Sam, that you commissioned?
For sure. Unbreakable is one that I hold quite dear to me because it holds so much power as a series in itself. A lot of the commissions that we produce for Crime Investigation and Sky History being the two main channels that we produce for the short form, mid form content, the Crime Investigation side of things really allows us to kind of make sure that we're being really purposeful with the content that we produce, and really making sure that we're victim focused, sensitive in our approach, making sure that what we're producing is valuable from a viewer perspective. And that's at the heart of everything that we do as a brand. But in the short form and mid form space, obviously, where you're playing with tone and you're playing with themes and formats, you want to kind of push those edges a little bit, but obviously kind of hold to the heart of that kind of that true value about why true crime exists. It's not a entertainment, format. It may be entertaining, and that's maybe why people watch it. But from my perspective, the reason why true crime exists is because it's giving, voice to the voiceless. It's helping kind of tell us stories that maybe wouldn't be told otherwise. It's really helping, people kind of understand what people kind of go through in really kind of horrifying and traumatic circumstances. And for me, Unbreakable really does do that. It is a series where we have Nina, the host, Nina Ulk. She is a victim, a survivor of domestic abuse and honor killing survivor. And she is now a wellness coach and a really great vehicle for kind of understanding kind of how people can process trauma and kind of go on a journey, a positive journey where they kind of see kind of like a light at the end of the tunnel. And Nina hosts this series where she sits opposite a different person who's been through a different traumatic experience, something that ultimately has kind of gone on to define them, but also a process that they've been on, a journey that they've been through where ultimately has led to some kind of, positivity, germ of positivity. And the stories that they've got to tell are truly kind of, disarming, horrifying, traumatic stories that really do need telling. We've got Hiba Wadare, who talks about female genital mutilation in a homeland in Somalia. We've got Ilya Batista, who talks about sex trafficking from the UK to her journey from the UK through Amsterdam, and some of the kind of like the anecdotes, some of the stories they tell are quite horrifying. I was watching rough cuts on the train at 7 a.m, trying to hold back tears, watching kind of those cuts, and they're really quite hard to watch, and that is a challenge in its own right. Really, when you're making those shows, is how to kind of make it kind of almost kind of palatable to an audience member, but really kind of keep hold of the truth behind those conversations and those stories. So Unbreakable has a real kind of purpose to it, and it's really driven by that purpose. And I was really kind of thankful that we were able to kind of get that format across and produced in a way that was at its core really kind of so close to that initial kind of development idea about the rawness and the sensitivity and the energy that those stories needed to tell them, truthfully and honestly and thoughtfully.
Well, I think it's really important when it comes to true crime on social media, because there's no rules, right? And there's a lot of content creators out there who are perhaps, pursuing true crime stories in a way that, in a very different way that, a broadcaster essentially would do as well. And I think that really underlines the value, of being able producing responsible production when it comes to true crime and lots of other types of content, and that's something obviously you pride yourself in.
Absolutely. And that, looking at the way that podcasters, TikTokers who focus on true crime, the way that they're communicated to their audience is really interesting to us as a broadcaster, because the whole different way of kind of consuming these stories and translating these stories out there, it may not necessarily be a way in which we, based on our values, can see a way in which we can take a slice of that kind of that viewing or listenership kind of pie. And it's perhaps not the right thing for us to do, but part of kind of the project that we have is to really kind of test where those boundaries are for us as a broadcaster, as a responsible broadcaster. Yeah. Where it comes to kind of testing the tonal boundaries or thematic boundaries and the topical boundaries. Yeah. Bearing in mind obviously all the compliance and legal
duty of care.
Of care, exactly. All the stuff that not just because we have to adhere by it, but because we should. And that's really kind of at the core of how we're looking at true crime and how we're really trying to make sure we kind of stays kind of core to everything that we do commission and at the core of everything that we do produce. But at the same time, trying to kind of work out where those boundaries are. Sometimes we may end up making a mistake and maybe kind of pushing things too far, but that's part of the test and learn remit and understanding where we should sit and how we can kind of talk to a digital first audience that doesn't feel exactly the same as one of the documentaries that we produce that you'd see on a TV channel. Yeah. So it's a real kind of like wrestling for us in terms of how we approach that.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I think one of the things that occurred to me, we had a conversation a few months ago on Telecast about true crime on socials, and actually true crime on streamers as a whole. And there is that difference that certainly contributors who that content is there and living out there all the time. It's been discovered all the time. It's not like a linear broadcast when it's there and then it's gone again.
Yeah.
So it's a very different sort of duty of care consideration that when that sort of content is in the streaming world, whether it's be YouTube or whether it be an SVOD. So it's a very different approach to it, isn't it?
Absolutely is, and you've got to kind of consider it in a very different way because the kind of the guidance and the regulations that kind of help steer and make sure that you kind of make the best possible ethical and decisions in terms of how you approach productions and distribution and everything else. Ultimately, they're kind of like changing now, right? They're because there's new platforms, new landscapes, new ways of communicating with an audience, and we're learning with that. And I think that as a broadcaster, and I'm speaking for my colleagues here really more than myself, we're really good at when it comes to true crime in terms of how we distribute it and the decisions that we make. I know that because I can see it, and I can see the the language that people use and the way that they approach it, and how we really want to make sure that a core principle of how we approach true crime is value driven and is purposeful at its core. I mean, I don't know whether we're going to touch on it, but a new commission that we've got kind of coming up, which is in production at the moment, called I Made a Murderer. That's a working title with Fork Studios. For us, it was commissioned before, but when Adolescence came out and there was the whole story in that about the perpetrator's family, that for us really kind of like lined up in terms of, from a zeitgeist moment, a kind of a conversation that was happening quite coincidentally, but also quite happily for us in terms of how we can make sure that we're delivering different stories, but still really purposeful and driven stories that really should be told. And for us, that's really about meeting essentially another victim behind these crimes, and that is the perpetrators' families, ones that ultimately don't have perhaps as much agency or the ability to kind of speak in their own words as everybody else that's been affected by the crimes, because essentially that power has been taken from them, or they don't feel comfortable in that situation. And for us being able to kind of tell that story, but still do it sensitively in a way that means that we're not undermining the victim's family or the from a process perspective, anything else that kind of has come across from the crime itself, is really valuable, because we're kind of giving a voice to the voiceless. And for me, that's really important, and something that again kind of comes back to the core why we're doing true crime, and is something that I'm really driven by and motivated by.
So tell us, what other channel brands you're commissioning digital first projects for then, Sam?
So as I've mentioned, Sky History and Crime Investigation, those are our two core channel brands really, and they have SVOD extensions, History Play and Crime Investigation Play, which are kind of probably two of the most important kind of TV viewing experiences for our audiences. Content does get distributed on broadcast abroad on Sky and Virgin and wherever else you can kind of get hold of our TV channels, but SVOD is equally important for us in terms of how we access our audiences. We do have Blaze as well, a free-to-air channel, but we're not specifically commissioning content for that or otherwise. But content may end up kind of migrating over to there depending on rights and that kind of thing, and obviously theme and topic. But it's really focused on those two channels.
Okay. And have you got a particular focus right now that you're looking to commission for those two channel brands? Can you give any digital first producers out there some sort of clues about what you might be looking for?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this year has been our kind of big move into doing more history. Crime investigation and true crime has been our focus primarily over the first year and a half. So we are looking at more history format ideas, but at the same time still looking at true crime. We're looking at kind of studio-based ideas, how we can kind of be focused in how we can kind of make get as much value on screen as possible based on the budgets that we're offering. Really kind of be make sure that that the producers, the partners that we work with are getting their value back from the ideas that we're kind of handing over. But otherwise, what I'm excited about kind of like next is perhaps, different ways that we can kind of tell history stories, different ways that we can tell true crime stories we haven't done yet. For history, that might be like panel shows, quizzes. It might be formats where you can kind of more experiential formats where you can really kind of touch and feel history with your hands. That might be studio based on a table, or it might be metal detector in a field. But for me, that kind of experiential idea, I think, is really interesting and a real kind of like digital first way of kind of communicating history stories. And I'd place underneath all that, it goes without saying, obviously with the studio panel or quiz show elements, that there's kind of like, we want a sprinkle of entertainment underneath all of this.
Yeah.
We don't want it to be dry. We want it to kind of make sure that we're kind of being entertaining and speaking in the right kind of language. But in the true crime space, it's really about how we make sure that story is first, and how we can kind of find the right formats to tell those stories in a similar way that we did with Unbreakable, making sure that we're kind of doubling down on the success that brought in terms of kind of like format-driven piece, in terms of the value that it brings, but also just making sure that we're finding the right people to tell those stories as well, and new and interesting ways that, say, haven't been told elsewhere by other content studios or other broadcasters. For me, that's kind of where we're kind of sitting at the moment.
Okay, and when you're talking about the platforms, presumably it's mainly YouTube that you're thinking about commissioning for, or does Facebook play a role as well?
Yeah, it's actually I mean, it's not really. YouTube is a key platform for us, but it's certainly not a key focus. I mentioned before about being kind of strategically unstrategic in the way we distribute, and that really kind of plays into everything that we do produce. I don't think I can think of anything that we haven't posted everywhere. And that really is kind of like a key remit under the kind of test and learn project kind of ideology for us, how we can make sure that we're kind of producing content that's going to go on Broadcaster VOD, on Subscriber VOD, on YouTube, on Facebook, on TikTok, on Instagram, on Snapchat, on everywhere. So we can really kind of make sure that we're kind of learning as much as possible. I would say that when we're producing a piece of content, there's always perhaps 2 platforms that we've got in mind that we want to kind of really kind of hone in on. For example, with History Crush, Katie is a TikTok and Instagram vertical creator. So we know when we're producing that, we need to make sure that it works in vertical. But at the same time, we want to kind of look at how we can translate her into a TV viewing experience, a more perhaps lean back experience. And so for me, in that, when we're kind of producing that content, it's how do we make it so it works on BVOD when you're on Sky and you download, a piece of content and you watch a show, how it works in that environment. But also, as you're scrolling through TikTok and there's a bit of thumb stopping content that you kind of can't go past because Katie's saying something kind of outlandish. It's those 2 really for me in terms of how we kind of make that piece of content. But that's not the same for everything. We'll have different kind of like goals with each piece of content.
Yeah. And what does success look like then for a piece of content? I mean, I imagine it's a range of things, but as you're testing and learning, is it the engagement? Is it the view figures? Is it watch time? Is it? I mean, I suppose it's an element of all of those. But what are those key measures of success for you when it comes to digital first content? Calling all you content creators out there. Want to save time and money? You can with Tanuki, the must-have collaboration platform. Cheaper and more user-friendly than Frame.io and quicker and more accurate than Trint, with the added benefit of speaker diarization, meaning Tanuki will remember your speakers so you only have to label them once. Plus, the built-in video conferencing tool with live streaming means you can share your content with collaborators across the world. All under one pay-as-you-go subscription. Change how you collaborate. Visit tanuki.io to find out more.
So it's kind of, again, it's kind of a bit project based, but it's really kind of broken down into a few different things. For us, it'll be the kind of like the format talent topical, thematical point that I said right at the beginning about how we can kind of make sure that we're kind of finding something out about something within the production. So we'll do kind of like survey rounds afterwards, or we'll dig into kind of sentiment data in comments, or, we'll do as much as we can to kind of find out how it's been viewed by our audience, so we can kind of make insight-driven decisions for the next piece of content that we might produce, or wherever else it might be, based on those points. And there's kind of like an audience platform part of it, which would be more the kind of the engagement side of things. And that for me, because obviously we're looking specifically at the content, obviously there's a whole load of other stuff like click-through rates on thumbnails and that kind of thing. But for me, it's very much about the engagement stats, so watch time, or the the retention rate, completion percentage, depending on the platform, whichever one works best. But for me, the kind of like those retention graphs, those retention curves that you get on most platforms, they're the ones that are most insightful for me, because they're really about looking at the quality of the content and where people are jumping off, where you're kind of seeing extra levels of engagement, where people are going back and watching it again. For me, that's the kind of like, that's the holy grail element of insight for me, and making sure that we're honing in as far as possible onto those insights, the positive and the negative, to make sure that in the next show we're iterating that, and again and again and again and again.
Yeah, so the lessons you're learning don't necessarily just apply to another episode of that same show. It could
absolutely
it could relate to a new show that
absolutely
you're producing.
So it's the kind of the fundamental like first kind of key thing is no fear of failure. Don't get worried if you don't see views on something. For me, it's very much about like leave the ego at the door kind of thing.
Well, that's brilliant, but that's rare, isn't it? I mean, especially with a big media organisation, it's almost contrary to how a major media organisation works.
Perhaps I would say that the vast majority of the people I speak with at Hearst Networks are definitely on that journey, and they understand it, and they're kind of like, and they're with it for sure, because you can see the insights you get from it, you can see the value that you get from it, you can see the journey and the narrative that you build from it. And I would say, outside of Hearst, like I'd imagine every single person that you speak to is definitely within that kind of mindset, because there's no way that you can succeed if you don't think in those terms. Yeah. Your previous episode with Evie from Channel 4, one of the kind of the really great bits in I can't remember what point it was in, maybe 10 minutes in, 15 minutes in, where Evie's talking about kind of like learning about the first 1 minute, the first 30 seconds, almost like, and we had exactly the same experience about 2 years previously, where we were putting kind of context, explainers, intros at the top of the content that we were producing, almost thinking kind of slightly more TV production focused.
Recaps,
kind of, yeah. Kind of thinking in the same terms, kind of thinking like, almost taking a 30-minute hour commercial like TV script and kind of just trying to kind of shorten the whole experience to 8 minutes. When actually it's a completely different language and it's a completely different viewing experience. It's so much more front loaded. You've got to ride the wave all the way through, whatever duration you're pumping out.
So it's like the reveal right up front, and
absolutely,
then how you get to the reveal almost is the design of the show.
For sure. And you've got to make sure that you kind of hit people right from the very start. There's so much about it is kind of like is making sure that you kind of get that retention, those first 3 seconds, but then keep riding that wave for as long as possible. Yeah. Making sure that you kind of like leave as much as you can to assumption, because what you don't want to do is over explain things, because those are essentially jumping off points. They're points at which people would make a decision to stop watching, and you want to kind of cut as many of those out as possible. Like I'd imagine right at the beginning of this, the YouTube video or whatever, or the short that you produce, you're going to start with kind of like me or you start saying something, quite energetic and revealing, and that is kind of like the right kind of, thought process, and making sure that is, we do that as much as possible. I would say we're still making that mistake. We're still putting too much kind of context and too many jumping off points and too much low energy at the start. And no doubt we'll continue making those mistakes. But we're certainly doing it a lot less than we used to. Yeah. And as long as we kind of keep on looking at those engagement stats, then we'll kind of keep on making those mistakes less often. And it's about kind of continuing on that journey.
And now it's time for Story of the Week, where my guests get to nominate the content industry news story that's caught their eye in the past 7 days. Sam, what's your Story of the Week?
Well, I sent you two, Justin. because there were two stories that kind of caught my attention that I wanted to dig into. They're on a very similar kind of like angle. Right, well, let's start with the more boring one, I guess, which is the acquisition of Captivate by Publicis. And it's, for me, it's the kind of like, it's the news that kind of, gets, you see it in all the kind of the major kind of, marketing, social media, digital first kind of publishing outlets. But for me, that's kind of like, it shows kind of where we're at as a wider media industry. Yeah. There's so much value being given to, the creator network. The fact that, I had actually not heard of Captivate before, but it covers, I believe I read 95% of content creators with over 5,000 followers. And for me, it's just kind of like mind-boggling that the kind of like the reach that has, and then them joining Publicis with their extended kind of network of different other content creator platforms and their obviously legacy of working with talent and nurturing them and kind of sending them out. For me, that whole story of creator straight to brand is quite kind of scary for the broadcast industry, but also I think is a bit of a should be kind of seen as a bit of a shock to the system, and one that we should really kind of look at and think, well, actually, we need to make sure that we're not getting left behind on that. Yeah. So if we're, as a broadcaster, trying to kind of invite creators to us, but we don't necessarily have the budgets that, an FMCG kind of company has to pay for them on their platform, how do we make sure that either we're bringing the brand money in by delivering, say, trust or whatever scalable value that we can offer as a broadcaster.
Brand safety.
Brand safety, essentially, yeah, exactly. Or what can we offer those creators from a experience, intelligence perspective that helps them kind of go on their journey through as a communicator, or maybe find people at the beginning of their journey. And that to me is quite exciting, because that's about kind of making sure that we're being kind of future focused in terms of our journey on what is going to be kind of like a new world in 5-10 years. Yeah. So that was the one that kind of jumped out to me probably the most.
Moments Lab helps production companies to boost revenue opportunities with its award-winning AI, MXT2. MXT2 automatically describes videos like a human, helping you find the right clips in seconds. Highlight key moments from scripted and unscripted shows. Customize MXT2 to pick out the best shots and sequences and rapidly turn your clips into viral content. Access, discover, and repurpose your content faster. Visit momentslab.com or meet the team at the Telecast Digital Video Awards. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because you look at, one of the publishing brands that you could say sort of almost created the format for a lot of social video and brand-funded social video, Lad Bible, for example. Yeah. It's really interesting to see how they're going to adapt to, creators and brands working directly together. And I think it's same for publishers, but it's same for broadcasters. It's actually it's the same challenge, isn't it?
It is for sure. And that's, it might be that ultimately, that the kind of like the brand funded content ultimately kind of gets you the higher value hosts, because you can kind of pay for their costs, which are obviously kind of rising. But certainly in our world where we don't have the budgets that can stretch that far, and we want to make sure that we're making honest decisions in terms of where our producers' budgets go, and that we're not kind of like really focusing them fully on, say, talent or whatever that's going to kind of carve up X% of their budgets. It might be much more kind of like real people focused and not really kind of focusing on those hosts. So it might be more kind of unbreakable, like how we can kind of make sure that as a brand we're using our value and legacy and platform to tell human stories, or to be able to kind of tell stories, say, and that obviously true crime example, but it could be kind of like historical stories or even kind of any other kind of factual story itself. And for me, there's a real interesting kind of challenge in that. It's scary, but it's also, any kind of like scary challenge is also an opportunity to kind of like to be seized, right?
Yeah, disruption does create huge opportunity, doesn't it? And there's as long as you're willing to step into the unknown a little bit, and as you're doing test and learn, then that's that's the only way you're going to succeed, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And how about your other story of the week?
Yes, the second news piece was the PSB comedy heads from BBC, Channel 4, and ITV talking on a panel recently about where kind of comedy, where sketch comedy is kind of going. And, there was nothing, I certainly don't want to kind of challenge anything that they said, because it was, it came from an honest place, and I can kind of see their remit for it. But part of the story was very much about how we can bring more sketch comedy back to our TV channels. From my perspective, I think there was something missing in the story there, which was about how certainly ITV, Channel 4 and BBC can maybe kind of go to social platforms to really kind of make sure that they're nurturing and owning social first sketch comedy on those platforms first, before thinking about how they can get the right kind of development ideas or treatments that goes direct to TV. Like for me, I think about like the sketch comedy that I've watched recently, say like Key and Peele. Can't remember the last time I watched a Key and Peele on TV, but I've watched it on TikTok and on YouTube Shorts. And for me, that's kind of how I consume that content now. And I'm not even kind of the main age demographic for those platforms. And I think if we're thinking in those terms, it's got to be how you build that kind of brand loyalty and that trust to then ladder them up into kind of like a much more lean back, long form viewing experience, and how you can get them through to that. And in the same terms about kind of like thinking, if there is a perceived decline in character comedy, like how you can kind of make sure that you're developing that on social platforms. Because I don't see that decline. I can see kind of character comedy on TikTok, because I follow some of them. They're developing characters. It doesn't naturally translate to TV because it's not thought out in the same way that 90s and 2000s, well, and earlier, obviously, kind of sketch comedy was pulled together. But those germs of ideas can be developed on social platforms first. And BBC, Channel 4, they're definitely, I know BBC are doing this because you can see what BBC Studios are doing. Yeah. But I think there's perhaps a narrative from a commissioner to producer line, and also the rest of the business, the social teams and marketing teams and programming teams, about how to make sure that they're reaching the audience in the right possible way and not trying to kind of force the viewing experience when essentially the eyeballs are already moving. And it's about making sure that you've got that right user journey. Yeah,
no, it's interesting. It's almost seems like it's, that battle's always already been won and lost, right? And it's kind of moved on a little bit, but that's not to say there isn't great opportunity for sketch, on the PSBs, right?
Absolutely, I completely agree. I completely buy into that. For me, there's a massive opportunity still, but it's about kind of approaching it with the right kind of mindset, in my view. And it's perhaps about kind of putting, development opportunities like BBC Three, or those, or what would have been kind of like Radio and Radio 4. Those opportunities where people would have honed their craft previously, but how you make sure that they're using the platforms under the BBC arm or the Channel 4 name or ITV in a different kind of way. And, they're doing it, but it's about kind of making sure that we're driving producers towards that, as opposed to kind of thinking about how they can go TV first, in my view.
Yeah, interesting. And how about your hero of the week?
Hero of the week was a difficult one for me, not because there aren't any heroes, but because I didn't want to be as earnest and be like, Justin, you're my hero of the week. So I'm going with Walking with Dinosaurs on BBC.
Right.
Jurassic Park's coming back. Walking with Dinosaurs is back. It's a big time to be a dinosaur fan. Very excited about it. There's been a little bit of, discontent, should Jurassic World obviously be returning? Should Walking with Dinosaurs be done in the way that it's been done? There are those kind of rumblings, but for me, I'll watch dinosaurs in any kind of any form, and I'm still a kid at heart. And
all right, what's your favourite dinosaur?
Favourite dinosaur? Well, I've got two answers for that. So this is so boring now. One is Baryonyx.
Right.
And it my head exploded when the Baryonyx came out of the lava in one of the Jurassic World films. Because it's a UK dinosaur, but it's still kind of meat eater. It's still got the claws, the teeth, everything. I love the fact when I was a kid that there was a big, UK-based kind of carnivore dinosaur.
Yeah.
So that's still one close to my heart.
Britosaurus, yeah.
And the second one is a Camarasaurus, because I did my dissertation on modelling where its kind of air sacs would have been, and whether it could have floated, and whether it could have stood up on its hind legs, whether it could have run.
Okay.
The boring stuff. That's so I've got a bit of a soft spot in my heart for Camarasaurus.
Okay. Well, it's the first time I've ever asked anybody what their favourite dinosaur is.
You need to make it a feature.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to have one. It's dinosaur of the week.
Yeah.
And who or what are you telling to get in the bin?
Get in the bin is the phrase "TV is dead" or "TV is dying," because I absolutely hate when I see that phrase. And sorry if anyone close to me has put that on LinkedIn and is now thinking that I hate them, because that's not the case. The phrase is the thing that I hate, because for me, TV is not dead. It's not dying. It's just changing, and it's evolving. And TV will always exist. It's just going to disappear. It's going to be in a different form.
Yeah. And what the term TV means is changing, probably. Yeah.
Exactly. Everything changes. Everything always evolves. The way that people kind of consume video is going to continue to evolve. And so for me, like, whether it's still on what we kind of we term as a linear experience, or whether it's VOD, or whether it's on TV or on your mobile, like, who cares? It's still TV in my head. And I think to a certain extent, TV will kind of continue in terms of some of the stuff that we hold dear in terms of the viewing experience. Like, live sport is always going to be live sport. Yeah. You can't view that in any other way, really. Maybe the platform can change, and maybe kind of like the data that's afforded to you can kind of change, but ultimately the experience is still the same. Yeah. It's still a linear experience. Yeah. And so from my perspective, 20 years in the future, things will look different, but TV will still exist.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good place to end.
Sure.
Sam, thank you so much for joining me on Telecast.
Thank you.
It's been brilliant speaking to you, and all the best with all the shows with Hearst Networks UK.
Great.
That was Sam Pearson from Hearst Networks UK, giving us a real insight into how digital-first strategy is being put into action across their entertainment, factual and history brands. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe and share Telecast with your network. We're on all podcast platforms. Just search Telecast TV on YouTube as well. Telecast was produced by Spirit Studios and recorded in London. We'll be back next week with a special show rounding up all the highlights of the Telecast Digital Video Awards. Until then, stay safe.